What if the world's most dangerous war didn't end with a final explosion, but with total silence? For 13 straight nights, American bombs fell on Iran without stopping. Then, one night, they just didn't fall anymore, and nobody in Washington explained why. Before we go any further, I need 30 seconds of your time. If you like knowing the real story behind the headlines, tap that like button right now. It costs you nothing, but it tells me you want more videos like this one. And while your thumb is already there, hit subscribe too, because what I'm about to walk you through is still unfolding as we speak. So let's set the scene properly, because most people only caught fragments of this story between other headlines. For nearly 2 weeks, the United States ran one of the most intense military campaigns against a single nation that we've seen in a long time. Night after night, American jets and missiles hit targets scattered across Iran. Reports say the target list included more than 300 separate sites. 13 nights of strikes, back to back, with almost no pause in between. That kind of pace is brutal even for a superpower. Most wars slow down after a few days. This one didn't, not for nearly 2 weeks straight. Then, on a Friday night, it stopped. No victory speech, no press conference, no president stepping up to a podium to explain what had changed. Just quiet. A defense official later told reporters that operations were, in their words, on hold. Not finished, not called off, on hold. That phrase matters more than it sounds like it should, because a hold is not peace. A hold is a pause with a hidden countdown attached to it, and outside a small circle of officials, nobody knows exactly how long that countdown is set to run. Here's the real question almost nobody's asking clearly enough. Why would the most powerful military on the planet suddenly go silent at the exact moment it looked ready to escalate even further? To understand that, we need to rewind, because this didn't happen out of nowhere. Go back to last summer. Israel and Iran fought a brutal 12-day war that pulled outside powers into the fight almost immediately. It ended with something the modern world had never seen before. The United States struck Iran's nuclear facilities directly, hitting the enrichment sites Iran had spent decades building and protecting. For the first time in history, an American president ordered a direct strike on another country's nuclear program, a line analysts had long warned could never be uncrossed once it was crossed. A ceasefire followed. Washington and Tehran signed an understanding that opened a 60-day window, a narrow chance to turn a fragile pause into something that could actually last. Anyone who studies conflict will tell you these windows are usually the weakest part of any war. From far away, they look like peace. Up close, they're often just exhaustion wearing peace's clothes. That window didn't hold. Talks planned in Switzerland, meant to be quiet and technical, were canceled before they even started. Trust between the two countries, already thin after decades of hostility, kept wearing away. By spring, strikes on Iran's nuclear sites had picked back up. Iran's own state media confirmed that Natanz, one of its most important enrichment complexes, was hit again in March. Tension kept climbing, each side testing the other, calculating how far it could push without triggering the full-scale war neither wanted to admit it was edging toward. By the middle of this July, that slow build-up had turned into something that genuinely looked like open war. The United States was striking Iran almost every night. Iran, and the groups aligned with it, were hitting back across the region, targeting military bases, commercial ships, and countries caught in the middle. That was the world just 10 days before this video was made. A campaign so relentless, so sustained, that it had stopped looking like a limited strike and started looking like a full air war. And it was exactly that pace, exactly that unsustainable intensity, that forced a decision behind closed doors that changed everything. Here's what actually happened, based on accounts that officials gave directly to reporters afterward. On a Friday, President Trump sat down with his most senior political and military advisors inside the White House. He was weighing something far bigger than the strikes already underway. Multiple sources describe it plainly as a serious escalation, a much larger operation than anything attempted so far in this war. According to that reporting, the plan included widening strikes to hit energy infrastructure directly, going after coastal radar and air defense systems, and even discussing a possible move toward Karg Island, one of Iran's most important oil export terminals. Stop and picture what that would have meant. Not a strike on a nuclear site buried under a mountain. Not a hit on a military command post. An assault aimed straight at the economic lifeline of an entire nation, and quite possibly troops physically present on Iranian soil for the first time in this whole conflict. That's not a bigger version of the same war. That's an entirely different war, with different risks, different casualties, and a completely unknown ending. In that room, at that exact moment, two of the most powerful people inside America's national security system pushed back against it. If this video is actually helping you understand what's happening instead of just reacting to another scary headline, do one small thing for me. Send it to the one person in your life who keeps asking what's really going on with Iran and never gets a straight answer. That single share is genuinely what keeps a channel like this able to dig into stories properly instead of chasing whatever gets the most panicked clicks. Now let's talk about who pushed back in that room and why it matters more than almost anything else in this entire story. Vice President J.D. Vance raised concerns about escalating the war any further, and General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the single most senior uniformed officer in the entire American military, raised a warning that almost never gets leaked to the public this fast. According to the sources describing that meeting, General Kane told the room the larger operation could absolutely be carried out. He didn't say it was impossible. He said it could likely succeed. But then he laid out, in front of the president, exactly what it would cost the country to pull it off. That cost wasn't just measured in dollars, although the dollars alone are staggering. It was measured in interceptors, in missiles, in the exact stockpiles that exist to protect American troops, allied nations, and global shipping lanes from retaliation. General Kane specifically raised deep concern about the supply of Patriot air defense interceptors, the very system that had been protecting bases, cities, and tankers throughout this entire war. Here's a number that should stop you for a second. By this spring, the Pentagon had already fired more than 1,200 Patriot missiles in this conflict alone. 1,200. Each interceptor costs more than $4 million. That's not a rounding error tucked into a defense budget somewhere. That's a massive ongoing drain on one of the most important defensive systems America owns. And that count was recorded before the most intense stretch of nightly strikes had even started. Now stack on top of that years of supporting Ukraine's war against Russia, plus the ongoing fight against Houthi forces in Yemen, and a much bigger picture comes into focus. America's stockpile of some of its most critical defensive weapons has been drawn down from several directions at the exact same time, and Iran is only one front competing for the same limited supply. This is the part of the story almost nobody talks about, and it's arguably the most important part of all. Wars aren't only won or lost through courage or political will, they're quietly constrained by inventory. You cannot fire a weapon you don't have. You cannot intercept a missile with an interceptor sitting in a warehouse 3 oceans away waiting to be built. And when the country's most senior military officer stands in front of the sitting president and says plainly, "We can win this fight, but might not have enough interceptors left to defend ourselves afterward," that isn't hesitation. That's arithmetic, wearing a military uniform. The United States ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, went on national television the following weekend to explain all of this publicly. And he did something fairly unusual for someone in his position. He didn't deny the stockpile problem. He admitted it plainly, saying a lot of stockpiles are depleted, pointing to years of weapons sent to Ukraine and the drawdown caused by the fight against the Houthis. And in the same breath, he insisted America still has everything it needs to keep the campaign going if the president decides to. Notice the tension inside that one statement. Stockpiles are depleted, yet everything needed is still available. Both presented as true at once. That contradiction, careful phrasing, or simple spin is exactly the space this pause is living inside. So the strikes stopped. But in any war, stopping strikes is rarely really about stopping. It's almost always about buying time. And the real question becomes, time for what and for whom? The official line coming out of Washington is that this pause exists to give diplomacy a genuine chance. Waltz described it as giving talks room to develop. A senior official told reporters the president's preference has always been diplomacy first, but that he wanted Iran to see clearly what would happen if it refused to come to the table seriously. In other words, the pause is being presented, at least publicly, as pressure. Stop the bombs for now, but leave the threat of even heavier bombs sitting visibly on the table and see whether that pressure is enough to push Iran toward real negotiation. There's just one significant problem with that version of events. Iran is not telling the same story at all. If you've made it this far, you already care more about actually understanding this war than most people who scroll past a headline and move on. Stick with me, because this next part is where things get genuinely uncomfortable and where most coverage stops looking closely enough. Iran's foreign ministry held a televised press conference this week, and the spokesperson did not sound like a government quietly preparing to sit down at a table. He stated plainly that there are no talks currently underway with the United States. Not pause talks. Not talks in preparation behind the scenes. No talks at all. He went further, saying, Iran will never allow the United States to decide the timing of war and peace on its behalf. He placed responsibility for the entire military confrontation squarely on Washington, calling it aggression Iran holds America directly accountable for. He also singled out European allies of the United States, including France and Britain, accusing them of what he called complicity with the aggressor, and said Iran had expected the new British government to act more wisely than the one before it. This is not the language of a country quietly preparing to compromise. This is a government deliberately drawing lines in public for its own citizens and the watching world, making clear that whatever peace arrives will have to look like a victory it can present at home, not surrender dressed up in diplomatic language. So here's the honest picture. Washington says, this pause exists to give room for negotiation. Tehran says there's no negotiation happening anywhere right now. Both statements can technically be true at the same time. That overlap, that quiet contradiction sitting underneath the surface, is exactly what makes this moment so unstable. A pause that each side is interpreting through a completely different lens isn't a foundation you can build peace on. It's a shared silence in which each side is quietly rearming, repositioning, and watching closely to see who blinks first. There is one place, though, where something resembling real diplomacy is genuinely happening, and it deserves your full attention because it reveals what this entire war is actually about underneath all the missiles and political statements. Iranian and Omani officials have been meeting directly inside Tehran, specifically to discuss shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's foreign ministry has been careful, almost deliberately careful, to frame these talks as strictly bilateral, a conversation purely between two coastal nations about safe passage through shared waters, explicitly unrelated to the United States or the wider war. Why does that distinction matter so much? Because the Strait of Hormuz isn't just a narrow strip of blue water on a map somewhere far away. It's one of the single most important choke points for global energy transport on the entire planet. A massive share of the world's seaborne oil passes through that narrow channel every single day, feeding economies on every continent. Whenever tension rises in this region, the first thing global markets watch closely isn't troop movements or political speeches. It's tanker traffic quietly moving or failing to move through Hormuz. And markets have been watching very closely indeed. During this pause in direct fighting, the global price of oil actually dropped by more than 6%, settling down around $90 a barrel. Read that carefully, because it tells you something important. Prices didn't spike during a supposed ceasefire the way fear-driven markets normally behave. They fell. That single detail tells you something significant about how fragile, how closely watched, and how deeply uncertain this whole standoff genuinely is. Global markets aren't pricing in real peace here. They're pricing in a temporary exhale, a brief moment where the immediate threat to shipping eases just enough for traders to relax slightly, while fully expecting this calm could reverse at any moment without warning. If you're starting to notice how many moving pieces are actually connected inside this one conflict, oil markets, missile stockpiles, diplomatic statements, strategy sessions inside the White House, then you already understand exactly why this channel exists. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is a genuinely good moment to do it, because we're going to keep tracking every one of these threads as they move, not just whatever headline happens to be trending today. Now let's zoom all the way out, because this was never really just a two-country conflict, and the pause in strikes on Iranian soil has done almost nothing to calm the wider region around it. While the skies directly over Iran have gone quiet for the moment, the fighting connected to this broader war has continued in multiple places at once, often far from the cameras following the main story. Iran-backed Houthi forces in Yemen launched an attack that struck a fuel refinery inside Saudi Arabia, setting it ablaze. This wasn't a minor border skirmish easily brushed aside. It marked the first direct attack on Saudi oil infrastructure in 4 full years. A Patriot missile battery, operated by a Greek crew as part of a coalition air defense effort, intercepted additional Houthi drones and missiles fired toward another Saudi port city, one that handles the overwhelming majority of the kingdom's seaborne crude oil exports. This particular attack was itself described publicly as retaliation for earlier coalition strikes against Houthi positions elsewhere in Yemen. Do you see the pattern forming here? Even while the central storyline, the direct American campaign against Iran, sits officially paused, the machinery of this wider war keeps grinding forward through allies and proxies scattered across the region. Saudi oil terminals under threat for the first time in years. Rebel groups launching drones at some of the most important energy infrastructure on the planet. This is what a regional war looks like when the center goes quiet, but the edges keep burning underneath. And then there's a thread almost nobody expected to see tangled into a Middle Eastern war. And yet, here it is, unmistakably real. Iran has accused Ukraine of carrying out a long-range strike that killed a sailor aboard an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea, thousands of miles from the front lines most people associate with the Ukraine war. President Zelensky, meanwhile, has said publicly that Russia passed satellite imagery of Gulf states and American military facilities in the region directly to Tehran. 2 entirely separate wars, one raging in the Middle East and one grinding on in Eastern Europe, are now bleeding directly into each other through shared intelligence, retaliatory strikes, and overlapping alliances stretching thousands of miles apart. This isn't a simple story anymore, if it ever was one. It's a web, intricate and constantly shifting. Iran, the United States, Saudi Arabia, the Houthis, Israel, Russia, Ukraine, and Oman quietly mediating in the background, all connected through overlapping interests, decades-old grievances, and weapons supply chains under simultaneous strain at the exact same moment in history. So where does this actually go from here? And let's talk honestly about what could realistically happen next, because the honest answer, the one that respects your intelligence, is that nobody, not the sharpest analysts, not the officials inside the White House, not the clerics governing from Tehran, can tell you with real certainty which direction this conflict tips. The most immediate danger sitting underneath everything is this. If this pause was never really about opening the door to peace, and was instead mainly about buying time to rebuild depleted stockpiles of interceptors and munitions, then this quiet period carries an invisible expiration date built into it from the very beginning. Once stockpiles are sufficiently rebuilt, or once patience with slow-moving diplomacy simply runs out inside the White House, the underlying pressure to return to the larger campaign that was actively being discussed in that meeting doesn't simply disappear. It waits quietly in the background, fully capable of resurfacing the moment conditions allow it to. Remember exactly what was reportedly sitting on the table before Vance and Kane raised their objections in that room. Wider strikes reaching into energy infrastructure, coastal radar and air defense systems targeted directly, even serious discussion of a move on Karg Island, a location tied intimately to Iran's fundamental ability to export oil at all, its literal economic lifeline to the outside world. That plan was not canceled outright, at least not based on everything reported so far. It was set aside for now, specifically because the military's own most senior leadership warned openly that carrying it out could leave the United States dangerously exposed on its own defenses in the process. Setting a plan aside is a fundamentally different thing than abandoning it completely and permanently. On the other side of this equation, Iran has made abundantly clear through its own public statements that it does not see itself as defeated and does not see itself as remotely ready to negotiate purely on terms dictated by Washington. A government that stands in front of television cameras and tells its own people it will never let another country dictate when war ends and peace begins is a government actively positioning itself for a long, grinding confrontation, not a swift and tidy settlement. That kind of public rhetoric is never accidental. It's deliberately designed to prepare an entire population for continued hardship, not for imminent relief. Underneath every layer of this conflict sits the original reason this war restarted, Iran's nuclear program. Strikes carried out last summer and again this past March were aimed directly at slowing or permanently destroying that program's capabilities. Every account of the actual damage done has varied wildly depending on who's speaking and what interest they might have in the answer. Some officials have described the destruction as severe, even permanent, and irreversible. Other assessments, including some that leaked from inside America's own intelligence community, describe the damage as far more limited, suggesting the program had only been delayed by a matter of months rather than truly destroyed. When even a single country's own defense and intelligence agencies can't fully agree with each other on how much real damage was actually done, that uncertainty itself becomes a powerful reason for renewed conflict down the road. Nobody fully trusts any single assessment, which means nobody can honestly claim the underlying threat has actually been eliminated. That's the fundamental trap this entire war remains caught inside. You cannot be truly certain a nuclear threat has been eliminated without physically verifying it on the ground. You cannot verify it without independent inspectors and genuine cooperation from the country being inspected. And a country that has endured sustained bombardment for weeks at a time has very little practical incentive to voluntarily open its most sensitive military sites to outside verification in the middle of an active, ongoing war. Ongoing destruction on one hand and confirmation of that destruction on the other are being pulled in exactly opposite directions at the same moment, and that tension has no easy resolution in sight. We're getting close to the end here, and I want to bring every one of these threads together, because underneath everything we've walked through, there's one central truth that deserves to be said plainly and directly. Before we get there, if this kind of grounded, carefully researched breakdown is genuinely something you want more of, tap that subscribe button right now, because the next major update on this conflict could arrive at literally any moment, day or night. And I want you here the second it does, not scrambling to catch up somewhere else afterward. Here's the truth sitting at the center of all this. A pause in bombing is never the same thing as an actual end to a war. It never has been in any conflict, in any era of human history, going as far back as recorded history allows us to look. What we're watching unfold right now is not peace quietly breaking out across the Middle East. It's a system under enormous strain catching its breath for a moment before whatever comes next. The United States military, still the most powerful fighting force in the entire world, reached a genuine point where its own most senior officer had to stand directly in front of the commander-in-chief and say plainly, without flinching, "We can carry out this operation, but we may not be able to properly protect ourselves afterward if we do." That is not weakness on display. That is what genuinely responsible power sounds like when it's being brutally honest with itself in a room where nobody else is watching. But it's also a warning sign that shouldn't be ignored. because a superpower forced to ration its own defensive stockpiles in the middle of a war it deliberately chose to escalate is a superpower operating far closer to its actual limits than most casual observers realize. On the other side of this standoff, a government sitting in Tehran stood in front of its own television cameras and told its own people that no outside power on earth gets to decide when this war truly ends. That is not the language of a country quietly looking for a graceful exit ramp. It's the language of a country settling in psychologically for whatever comes next, whether that turns out to be more negotiation, more sustained bombardment, or some uneasy combination of both happening at the same time. Sitting between those two positions is an entire region holding its collective breath. Oil tankers moving cautiously through the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi refineries recovering from a direct attack for the first time in 4 long years. Interceptor missiles fired at more than $4 million apiece just to protect infrastructure that keeps the global economy running day to day. And a nuclear question sitting unresolved at the very center of it all. One that nobody, not officials in Washington, not clerics in Tehran, not the international agencies specifically created to monitor exactly this kind of threat, can currently answer with any real confidence. Wars do not typically end with one single dramatic moment that everyone instantly recognizes as history unfolding. They end, or far more often, they escalate, through a long series of quiet decisions made inside rooms most of us will never see, by men and women weighing stockpiles and casualties and political survival against each other on scales the rest of us never get to examine directly. What happened this past week inside that White House meeting was exactly one of those quiet decisions. It didn't generate the same kind of dramatic headlines a missile strike naturally produces. But it may ultimately matter far more than any single bomb dropped during the last 2 weeks of fighting, because it revealed something the entire watching world genuinely needed to see and understand clearly. Even the most powerful military machine on Earth has a real measurable limit. And right now, both sides of this deeply dangerous standoff are quietly betting that the other one will hit that limit first. Whether that bet ultimately ends in a genuine, lasting peace, or in the very escalation that was quietly shelved this past week inside that room, is a question that won't be answered by speeches or press conferences or carefully worded official statements. It will be answered by what actually happens the very next time the skies over Iran fall silent again, and whether that silence finally turns out to be the sound of a long war genuinely ending, or simply the quiet, patient sound of both sides reloading for whatever comes next.